The wind in this part of the territory did not blow so much as it scoured. It carried a grit that tasted of ancient, pulverized stone, finding its way through the tightest window sash and into the deepest creases of a man's skin. Silas Reed pulled his hat brim lower, narrowing his eyes against the stinging dust. He sat atop his bay gelding, a horse as sturdy and uncomplaining as the land itself, and looked out over the dry draw where the creek used to run deep enough to soak a man to his waist. Now, it was a skeleton of white stones and cracked mud. The drought had settled over the valley like a heavy blanket 3 years ago, and it refused to lift. The cattle were bawling in the distance, a low, mournful sound that grated on Silas's nerves. He could count the ribs on the stragglers. Every rib was a testament to his failure to make the sky rain or the grass grow. He shifted in the saddle, and his left leg gave a sharp, familiar throb. The war had ended nearly 20 years ago, but the lead ball a Confederate surgeon had dug out of his thigh in '63 had left a ghost behind, an ache that flared whenever the weather turned or his spirit soured. Silas rode the fence line slowly. He was checking for breaks in the wire, but mostly he was counting losses. 2 calves gone since Tuesday, a section of cedar posts leaning hard where someone had likely hooked a rope to pull them down. Testing the perimeter. Rustlers were becoming bold, desperation driving men to theft just as it drove the cattle to madness. But it was not just the common rustlers Silas worried about. It was the silence. The valley felt too quiet, holding its breath before a strike. He was a man who kept his own counsel. In town, they tipped their hats to him because he paid his bills on time and could shoot a coin out of the air at 50 paces. But they did not invite him to Sunday dinners. Rumors clung to him like burrs. They whispered that the war had broken something inside him that never knit back together. They whispered about the wife he had buried 10 years ago, and how he had locked the door to her sewing room and never opened it again. They were right about the door, Silas thought as he nudged the horse forward. They were wrong about the rest. The war had not broken him. It had simply taught him that everything fragile eventually shatters. So a man best make himself into stone. 5 miles east, the town of Crossing Creek lay sweltering under the thin, merciless sun. It was a collection of raw lumber and ambition, a place where the church steeple tried to outclimb the false fronts of the 3 saloons. Elena Morales stood on the boardwalk outside the General Mercantile, her hands clenched in the folds of a dress that had been washed so many times the blue cotton was turning gray. She was hungry. It was a sharp, twisting pain in her center that had moved past urgency into a dull, constant nausea. She had arrived in Crossing Creek 4 days ago, stepping off the stagecoach with nothing but a small carpet bag and a reputation she had not earned. She adjusted the shawl over her shoulders. It was too warm for the wool, but the shawl hid the worst of the patches on her bodice. A pair of women walked past, their skirts rustling with starch and petticoats. They slowed as they neared Lena, their eyes sliding over her dark hair, the olive tone of her skin, and the worn leather of her boots. They did not speak to her. They spoke around her. "I heard the marshal say she was the only one left alive," one woman murmured, pitching her voice just loud enough to carry. "Curious, isn't it?" the other replied, sniffing the air as if Lena smelled of sulfur. "You have to wonder what she gave those bandits to make them spare her. No decent woman survives a massacre without a stain." Lena stared straight ahead, her spine stiff. She did not lower her eyes. She had learned in the last month that looking down was an admission of guilt, and she was guilty of nothing but surviving. The stage robbery had been a chaos of gunfire and screaming horses. She had crawled through the blood of strangers to hide beneath the carriage, shaking so hard her teeth rattled, praying in a whisper no one heard. To be called lucky, for it felt like a curse. She turned and walked toward the boarding house where she had stayed her first night. The owner, a thick-necked man with sweat stains mapping his collar, was sweeping the porch. He stopped as she approached, leaning on his broom like a weapon. "I told you, Miss Morales," he said, his voice loud. "We have no rooms. The sign in your window says vacancies," Lena said, her voice steady. The accent of her grandmother shaped her vowels, softening the hard edges of the English words. marking her as foreign to these ears. "The sign is old," the man grunted. "And even if it were new, the rate has gone up. $2 a night. In advance." He knew she did not have $2. He knew she did not have 2 dimes. Yesterday, she had washed dishes and scrubbed floors for the baker's wife for 12 hours, promised 50 cents at the end of the day. When the sun went down, the woman had tossed her a stale loaf of bread and told her the work wasn't up to standard. Slamming the door before Lena could protest, "I have money coming," Lena lied, lifting her chin. "Then come back when it arrives. But don't hurry." Laughter erupted from the doorway of the Emerald Saloon across the street. A group of men tumbled out, led by a tall figure in a coat that cost more than Lena's life was likely worth. Caldwell Vance was a handsome man if you did not look too closely at his eyes. He owned the largest spread in the valley, the Double Vi, and he owned the debt of nearly every merchant on this street. Beside him walked Deputy Harlan Pike, a man with a badge pinned to a vest that strained over a heavy gut. "Well now," Vance said, pausing to light a cigar. The flame flared, illuminating the sharp angles of his face. "If it isn't the miracle of the precipice. Miss Morales? Still with us?" "I see." Lena turned to go, but Pike stepped off the boardwalk, blocking her path. He smiled, and it was an expression devoid of humor. "Don't run off, darling," Pike said. "Mister, Vance was just admiring your fortitude. It takes a special kind of talent to walk away from 3 dead men without a scratch." "I was not unscratched," Lena said coldly. Pike chuckled, glancing back at Vance. "Hear that? She's got fire. I like that. You know, there is work for a girl like you at the saloon. Upstairs work. It pays better than washing sheets. And you clearly have the constitution for rough handling." The men around them laughed. It was an ugly, wet sound. Lena felt the heat rise in her face, not from shame, but from a fury so white-hot it made her vision swim. She looked Pike in the eye. "I would rather starve," she said. Pike's smile vanished. He took a step closer, invading her space, smelling of stale whiskey and hair oil. "Careful, girl," he whispered. "Starving takes a long time, and accidents happen fast in this town." He stepped back, tipping his hat with exaggerated politeness. Vance watched the exchange with boredom, as if he were watching a dog bark at a carriage. They moved on, leaving Lena standing alone in the dust. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them against her stomach to still them. She needed to leave. She needed to work. She needed to be somewhere where these men were not. A passing ranch hand, a boy no older than 18 with a sympathetic face, muttered to her as he hurried by. "Try the Reed place. Miss, old man Reed fired 2 hands yesterday for drinking. He's desperate." "He's 5 miles west, out past the Devil's Anvil. 5 miles. Lena looked at the sun. It was past noon. She had no horse. She had no water. But she had feet, and she had the memory of Pike's eyes stripping her bare. She gripped her carpetbag tighter. She began to walk. The land fought her every step of the way. The road to the Reed Ranch was little more than a pair of ruts carved into the hardpan clay. The wind picked up, driving grit into her eyes, drying her throat until swallowing felt like swallowing glass. Her boots, thin-soled and meant for city pavement, offered no protection against the sharp stones. By the 3rd mile, her heels were bleeding. By the 4th, she was stumbling. The landscape was vast and indifferent. Scrub oak and sagebrush stretched to the horizon, broken only by the jagged silhouette of the mountains. It was beautiful in a terrifying way, a place that demanded strength or death. Lena forced herself to focus on the rhythm of her breathing. 1 step, another step. She thought of her father, who had taught her to read by candlelight. She thought of her mother, whose laughter had filled their small house before the sickness took her, long before the stagecoach took the rest of what Lena loved. "I am not done," she told the sagebrush. "I am not done." When the ranch house finally appeared, it looked like a fortress against the sky. It was built of rough-hewn logs, bleached gray by the sun, with a wide porch and a chimney that puffed thin white smoke. A barn stood to the west, massive and shadowed. A corral held 3 horses that watched her approach with pricked ears. Lena stumbled as she reached the gate. Her vision grayed at the edges. She grabbed the rough wood of the fence to keep from falling, the splinters biting into her palm. She stood there, swaying, gasping for air that felt too thin to sustain her. A door slammed. Heavy boots crunched on the gravel. Silas Reed had been watching her from the porch for the last half-mile. He had thought she was a mirage at first, a trick of the heat. When he realized she was real, he assumed she was a traveler whose horse had thrown her. Now, seeing her cling to his fence, he assumed she was a beggar. He walked up to the gate, stopping a few feet away. He saw the dust coating her dark hair, the exhaustion etched into the lines around her mouth, the trembling of her hands. He felt a flicker of annoyance. He had work to do, and he was not running a charity ward. "If you are looking for the mission, it is back in town," Silas said. His voice was gravel, deep and unused to softness. Lena lifted her head. Her eyes were dark, rimmed with red dust, but clear. She looked at him, and Silas felt a strange jolt, as if he had touched a live wire. "I am not looking for a mission," she rasped. Her throat was so dry the words cracked. Silas reached into his pocket and pulled out $2 silver. He held them out over the fence. "I have no food cooked yet," he said, his tone dismissing her. "But take this. It will buy you a ride back on a wagon if one passes. And a meal. Go on now." Lena looked at the coins. They glinted in the sun. It was enough money to sleep in a bed tonight. It was enough to eat. She looked from the silver to Silas's face. She saw the judgment there. He saw a woman in a torn dress, covered in dust, holding out a hand. He saw a victim. Something inside Lena snapped. It was the same steel that had kept her quiet under the carriage while men died. She pushed herself off the fence, standing unsupported. She brushed the dust from her skirt with a sharp, defiant motion. She ignored the coins. "Sir, I don't need your pity," she said. Her voice gained strength, ringing clear in the dry air. "Just one chance to prove myself." Silas paused, his hand still extended. He looked at her more closely. He saw the set of her jaw. It was not the jaw of a beggar. "Prove yourself how?" he asked. "I heard you need hands." She said, "I can work." Silas almost laughed. "You? Look at you. You are about to blow away. This is a cattle ranch, not a millinery shop. The work here breaks grown men." "I am not a man," Lena said. "And I am not broken. I can wash, I can cook, I can mend, I can tend horses, I can do whatever you need done, and I will do it for half the wages of the men you fired." Silas lowered his hand, pocketing the coins. He was intrigued. He was also desperate. The house was a wreck. The accounts were a mess, and he was tired of eating beans out of a tin can. "It is $1 a day," he said, "and a roof over your head in the tack room off the barn. No meals unless you cook them yourself. And if you cannot keep up, you walk back to town." "I will keep up," Lena said. Silas studied her for a long moment. He saw the blood on her lip where it had cracked from dryness. He saw the terror behind her eyes that she was fighting to suppress. "1 week," he said, "a trial. If you are still standing in 7 days, we will talk about wages." "I will be standing," she promised. The first 3 days were a blur of agony. Lena learned that she had never truly known what work was. The ranch did not run on clocks. It ran on the sun and the needs of beasts. She was up before the dawn. The air in the uninsulated tack room so cold her breath plumed white. She hauled water from the pump, the buckets tearing at the blisters that formed on her palms within the first hour. She chopped wood, the axe handle jarring her shoulders until she thought her bones would separate. The ranch hands, a sour-faced man named Jeb and a younger, reckless rider called Shorty, watched her with open amusement that turned to hostility when they realized she wasn't leaving. "Hey, Duchess!" Jeb called out on the second day, as Lena struggled to drag a sack of feed across the yard. "Don't break a nail. The boss won't pay for a manicure." Lena did not answer. She gritted her teeth, braced her feet, and heaved the sack onto the pallet. She wiped the sweat from her forehead with a forearm that was already bruising. She cooked for them in the evenings, simple stews made from the dried beef and root vegetables in the cellar. They ate it without thanks, banging their spoons on the table. Silas ate in the main house, alone. Lena brought his plate to the back porch and left it there, collecting the empty dish in the morning. He did not speak to her, but she felt his eyes on her as she moved across the yard. He was watching, waiting for her to quit. On the fourth day, she was in the corral. A new Mustang, a roan mare with wild eyes, was pacing the fence, lathered in sweat. Shorty had been trying to break her all morning with a whip and a heavy hand, and he had only succeeded in terrifying the animal. He had given up in disgust, leaving the mare trembling. Lena walked to the fence. She had grown up with horses. Her father had been a farrier before the bad times. She knew that fear smelled like acid to a horse. She took a deep breath, forcing her own heart to slow. She unlatched the gate and slipped inside. From the porch, Silas stopped sharpening his knife. He stood up, ready to shout at her to get out before she was killed, but the shout died in his throat. Lena did not approach the horse. She stood still, her hands at her sides, palms open. She began to hum. It was a low, rhythmic sound, a Spanish lullaby she barely remembered. The mare pinned her ears back, stomping a hoof. Lena did not flinch. She kept humming, pitching her voice lower, a vibration that seemed to travel through the ground. Slowly, the mare's ears flicked forward. She stopped pacing. Lena took one step, then another. She moved like water, fluid and non-threatening. When she reached the horse, she did not grab the halter. She simply laid a hand on the mare's neck, stroking the damp coat. "It is all right," she murmured. "You are safe. No one will hurt you." The mare let out a long, shuddering breath and lowered her head, nudging Lena's shoulder. Silas watched from the shadows of the porch. He had seen men work horses for 40 years. He had rarely seen a touch like that. He looked at the woman standing in the dust, her dress stained, her hair escaping its pins, and for the first time, he saw her not as a problem to be solved, but as something rare. That evening, Silas found Lena in the barn. She was sitting on a crate under the lantern, a ledger book open on her knees. She jumped when he entered, snapping the book shut. "I was not prying. Sir," she said quickly, "I saw the grain bags were not tallying with the feed schedule. I just wanted to check." Silas walked over. He took the book from her hands. He looked at the page. Her handwriting was small, precise, and elegant. She had corrected a column of figures where Jeb had added 7 and 5 and gotten 13. She had noted a discrepancy of 4 sacks of oats missing from the last delivery. "You can read?" Silas asked, looking at her. "Yes, and cipher." Silas looked at the missing oat count. He had suspected Jeb was trading feed for whiskey in town, but he hadn't had the proof. Now it was here, in black and white. "You found 4 sacks missing?" "Yes, sir. And 2 coils of wire from the inventory list." Silas closed the book. He looked at her hands. They were raw, wrapped in strips of rag. "You should have told me you were educated." He said, "You asked for a ranch hand." Lena said, "You did not ask for a clerk." Silas handed the book back to her. "From tomorrow, you leave the heavy hauling to Shorty. You take over the inventory. And the books. If I am losing money, I want to know where it is leaking." Lena nodded, a flush of pride warming her cheeks. "Thank you, sir." Silas turned to leave, but a sudden boom of thunder shook the barn. The air pressure dropped instantly, heavy and electric. The storm had come out of nowhere, sweeping down from the peaks. Rain began to hammer the tin roof. A deafening roar. The wind slammed the barn doors open. Hay swirled into the air. "Grab the tack!" Silas shouted over the noise. "The roof leaks on the west side." They scrambled to cover the saddles and harness racks with heavy canvas tarps. The wind howled through the opening, driving rain sideways into the barn. Lena grabbed one end of a large tarp, struggling against the gust that tried to rip it from her fingers. Silas grabbed the other. They pulled it taut over the winter supplies. Silas reached past her to secure a rope, and the barn door slammed shut again, plunging them into sudden, relative quiet, though the rain still drummed overhead. They were standing inches apart in the dim lantern light. Lena was breathing hard, her chest heaving. A strand of wet hair was plastered to her cheek. Silas could smell the rain on her, mixed with the scent of hay and the faint, clean smell of soap. He looked down at her. The adrenaline of the storm was still humming in his blood. He saw the pulse jumping in the hollow of her throat. For a moment, neither of them moved. The space between them felt charged, heavy with something that was not just the storm. Silas felt a sudden, terrifying urge to reach out and brush the hair from her face. It was an impulse he had not felt in 10 years. It scared him more than the rustlers. Lena looked up at him, her eyes wide. She saw the conflict in his face, the softening of the hard lines around his mouth. She felt a pull, a magnetic weight in her belly. Then Silas stepped back. The mask slammed back down. "Good work," he said, his voice rough. "Get some sleep." He turned and walked out into the rain, leaving her standing alone in the circle of lantern light, her heart hammering against her ribs. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean and cold. Lena was by the corral, checking the water trough, when she saw dust rising on the road. Riders were coming, not 1 or 2, but 5. Silas came out of the house, his Winchester rifle cradled in the crook of his arm. He walked down to the gate, limping slightly. Lena moved to stand near the barn, watching. The riders slowed as they approached. It was Vance's men. She recognized the horses, fine animals that cost more than this entire ranch. The lead rider was a man with a scar cutting through his left eyebrow. He rode with a slouch, arrogant and easy. "Mornin'. Reed," the man called out. "Just checking for strays. Fences down on the South Ridge. Thought some of ours might have drifted in with yours." "I haven't seen any double V brands," Silas said, his voice level. "But you are welcome to ride the perimeter. Stay off the inner pasture." The man laughed. "Touchy, aren't you? We are just being neighborly." The rider's gaze drifted past Silas. It landed on Lena. He squinted, tilting his head. Lena felt the blood drain from her face. Her stomach turned to ice. She knew him. She did not know his name, but she knew the silver ring on his finger. She knew the way he sat in the saddle. She had seen him through the gap in the floorboards of the stagecoach. She had seen that hand reach down and tear the necklace from her mother's throat a second before the gun went off. The man stared at her. A slow, cold smile spread across his face. "Well now," he said softly. "Small world." He tipped his hat to Silas, wheeled his horse around, and the group galloped away, kicking up mud. Silas turned to Lena. He saw her face. She was pale as milk, trembling so hard she had to lean against the trough. "What is it?" Silas asked, stepping toward her. "Do you know him?" Lena could not speak. The wind scraped over the sage, whispering a threat. She wrapped her arms around herself, but she could not stop the cold. The past had found her, and this time there was nowhere to hide. The weather turned 3 days later, and it did not turn kind. The high, thin heat of the drought collapsed under the weight of a northern front that rolled down from the peaks like a gray curtain. It was not a wet snow that fell, but a hard, driving sleet that coated the sagebrush in ice and turned the dry creek beds into treacherous ribbons of glass. The wind found its voice, shrieking through the gaps in the barn siding, a constant, hollow moan that set the teeth on edge. Silas Reed pushed the crew. There was no choice. The cattle, already weakened by the long, dry spell, began to drift with the wind, moving blindly toward the box canyons where they would pile up and freeze if not turned back. Silas rode point, his face wrapped in a wool scarf, his hat pulled low. He worked with a cold efficiency, his commands sharp and brooks no argument. He was a man who knew that panic killed faster than the cold, so he buried his own fear under layers of task and duty. Lena worked alongside them. The trial week was over, but no one had mentioned it. She simply kept working. Her hands, already blistered, now cracked and bled in the cold. She wrapped them in strips of rags soaked in tallow and pulled on a pair of oversized leather gloves Silas had found in a trunk. She carried feed buckets that weighed nearly as much as she did, breaking the ice on the troughs with a crowbar, her breath puffing in white clouds that were snatched away by the gale. Jeb, the sour-faced older hand, watched her struggle to lift a bale of hay into the loft. He paused in his own work, spitting tobacco juice into the frozen mud. He did not offer to help. That was not the way of the West. But when she finally heaved the bale up, panting and trembling, he gave a short, sharp nod. "You got grit, girl," Jeb muttered as he passed her. "I will give you that." It was the most he had said to her in 10 days. Shorty, however, grew sullen. He saw Lena's presence not as help, but as an accusation. If a slip of a girl could haul water and mend fence, what excuse did he have for his own sloth? He took to whispering when she was near, dark comments about bad luck and women cursing a working ranch. Lena heard him. She kept her head down, her eyes on her boots. She had survived worse men than a sulky boy with a bruised ego, but the cold was a physical assault. At night, the tack room was little better than sleeping outside. The wind knifed through the single layer of planking. Lena slept fully dressed, wrapped in 2 horse blankets, shivering until her muscles cramped. Silas found her there on the 4th night of the freeze. He had come out to check a mare that was close to foaling. He held a lantern high, illuminating the small, cramped space. He saw Lena curled on the cot, a small, dark shape beneath the rough wool. She was asleep, but her face was pinched with pain. He stood there for a long moment, the cold seeping into his own boots. He remembered nights in the war, lying in freezing mud, wishing for nothing more than a dry patch of ground. He looked at the house, then back at the girl. He did not wake her. He simply turned and walked back to the main house. The next morning, there was a cast-iron stove in the corner of the barn near the tack room, and a pile of dry wood stacked beside it. Silas never said a word about it, and Lena knew better than to thank him. The evenings became their own ritual. Too cold to work outside once the sun fell. Silas allowed Lena to work in the main house, at the heavy oak table in the kitchen where the heat from the hearth kept the air breathable. She sat with the ledgers spread out before her, the oil lamp casting a golden circle over the pages. Silas sat in his armchair by the fire, mending tack or cleaning his rifle. The silence between them was thick, but it was no longer hostile. It was the companionable silence of 2 people who were too tired to speak. Silas watched her covertly. He watched the way her brow furrowed when she found a discrepancy, the way she dipped the pen with careful precision. She had a way of sitting, spine straight, shoulders back, that suggested a finishing school rather than a scullery. "You have a fine hand," Silas remarked one evening. The sound of his voice startled her, and the pen slipped, leaving a small blot of ink. Lena dabbed at it quickly. "My father insisted on it. He said a messy ledger meant a messy mind. Your father was a wise man," Silas said. "He ran a whetstone along the blade of his skinning knife. Is that why you are alone out here? Did he pass?" Lena stiffened. The question was gentle, but it probed at a wound that had not even begun to scab over. "He died 3 years ago," she said, her voice tight. "The sickness, my mother and I—" "We were traveling to meet family in Sacramento when the stage was taken." She stopped. The image of the dust, the blood, and the man with the silver ring flashed behind her eyes. She felt the phantom weight of a body pressing her into the dirt. Silas stopped his sharpening. He looked at her, really looked at her. He saw the way her hand trembled as she held the pen. He saw the terror that she kept locked behind a gate of rigid control. "You do not have to tell me," he said softly. "I know," Lena whispered. "But," Silas continued, his voice dropping to a rumble, "this country eats people who try to carry everything alone. It is too big for one set of shoulders." Lena looked up at him. The firelight caught the gray in his beard and the deep lines etched around his eyes. She saw kindness there, a raw, unpolished thing that terrified her. Cruelty she could handle. She could wall herself off against it. But kindness required an opening, and openings were dangerous. "I am managing, sir," she said, retreating behind the formality. Silas held her gaze for a second longer, then nodded and returned to his knife. "Suit yourself, Elena." Later that night, the house was silent. Lena was back in the tack room, the small stove glowing red. But in the main house, Silas was thrashing in his sheets. The dream was always the same. The smoke, the screams of the horses, the heavy, metallic smell of blood at Antietam. He woke with a gasp, sitting bolt upright, his hand reaching for the Colt Navy revolver on the nightstand before he was fully awake. He sat in the dark, his chest heaving, listening to the wind. He was sweat-soaked despite the chill. He rubbed a hand over his face, feeling the old scar on his thigh ache in sympathy with his mind. He was a survivor, just like the girl in the barn, and like her. He knew that the hardest part of surviving was not the event itself, but the long, quiet aftermath where the memories waited to ambush you. 2 days later, supplies ran critically low. The flour barrel was empty, and they were down to the last of the coffee. A supply run to Crossing Creek was unavoidable. Silas harnessed the team to the buckboard wagon. The roads were frozen ruts of mud, dangerous and jarring. "I need you to come," Silas told Lena as she emerged from the barn. "You know the inventory better than I do, and you have a head for prices." Lena hesitated. The thought of returning to town, of walking past the saloon where Pike held court, made her stomach turn. But she looked at Silas, at the set of his jaw, and nodded. "Yes, sir." The drive was long and cold. They sat side by side on the wagon bench. A heavy buffalo robe spread over their laps, their shoulders brushed with the jolting of the wagon. Silas drove with an easy competence, his hands steady on the reins. Lena watched the landscape roll by, white and gray and brown. When they rolled into Crossing Creek, the town felt hostile. Eyes followed the wagon. People stopped on the boardwalk to stare. It was not just Lena they watched now. It was Silas, too. By harboring the tainted woman, he had stepped outside the circle of acceptable behavior. They pulled up to the mercantile. Silas tied off the team. "Stay close," he murmured. Inside, the store was warm and smelled of spices and sawdust. The shopkeeper, a man named Miller with shifting eyes, greeted Silas with a nod that was a fraction too short to be respectful. "Mr. Reed," Miller said. "What can I do for you?" "We need flour," Silas said. 50 pounds, and coffee, beans, and 2 spools of heavy wire. Lena moved down the aisles, checking the quality of the goods. She picked up a sack of beans and frowned. It was weevil eaten at the bottom. She moved to the next one. She brought her list to the counter. Miller tallied the total on a piece of slate. "That will be $14.50, Miller said, not looking up. Lena's head snapped up. 14? The sign says flour is $3 a sack, and coffee is $2. By my count, it should be no more than $10. Miller's face reddened. "Prices have gone up. Missy, the weather, freight costs. The price on the barrel says $3, Lena insisted, her voice steady though her heart hammered. "You cannot change the price between the barrel and the counter." Miller sneered. "I can charge what I like to who I like. And for charity cases and strays." Silas's hand came down on the counter. It was not a slam, but the sound was heavy, final. The wood groaned. $10, Silas said. His voice was very quiet. "And you will give us the fresh beans from the back, not the sweepings you have on the shelf." Miller looked at Silas. He looked at the width of Silas's shoulders and the cold, flat look in his eyes. The bluster drained out of him. "Fine," Miller muttered. $10. Silas counted out the coins, placing them deliberately on the counter. "We will load it ourselves." As they carried the sacks out to the wagon, Lena felt a strange sensation in her chest. It was a tightness, but not of fear. It was the feeling of being defended. No one had stood between her and the world since her father died. She was securing the tailgate when a shadow fell over her. Deputy Harlan Pike leaned against the hitching post, picking his teeth with a splinter of wood. The silver star on his chest caught the weak sunlight. "Shopping day for the happy couple?" Pike asked, his voice dripping with false cheer. Lena froze. She gripped the side of the wagon. "Leave us be, deputy," she said. Pike pushed off the post and stepped closer. He lowered his voice. "You know, people are talking. A single woman living out there with a widower? It does not look good. Elena, it looks like you are trading favors again, just like you did with those bandits." Lena felt the blood rush to her face. "I did nothing." Pike chuckled. You survived. That is all the proof this valley needs. Tell me, is he better than the road agents? Does he pay better? The insult was so vile, Lena lost her breath. But before she could speak, a hand clamped onto Pike's shoulder. It was a large hand, rough with calluses. Silas spun the deputy around. Silas did not shout. He did not draw his gun. He simply stood very close to Pike, looming over him. You have a lot to say for a man who is supposed to be keeping the peace, Silas said. Pike shrugged off Silas's hand, stepping back, his hand hovering near his holster. I am just looking out for the moral standing of the community. Reed, you are keeping dangerous company. The only danger I see here is a man with a badge and a loose tongue, Silas said. Pike's eyes narrowed. His smile vanished. Careful. Reed, you have to live in this valley, and this valley remembers. Vance remembers. Silas stepped forward, invading Pike's space until the deputy flinched. Let Vance remember, Silas said. And you remember this. Stay away from my wagon, and stay away from her. He turned his back on Pike, a gesture of supreme dismissal, and climbed onto the wagon seat. Get in, Elena. They drove out of town in silence. Lena sat rigid, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. The shame Pike had tried to smear on her burned like acid. They were 3 miles out, the town swallowed by the gray hills. When Silas spoke, "Do not listen to him," Lena let out a shaky breath. How can I not? That is what they all think, that I sold myself to live. Let them think it, Silas said harshly. He snapped the reins. People think I am a butcher because of the war. They think I am a miser because I do not buy rounds at the bar. I am tired of pretending I care what they whisper. Lena looked at him. She saw the tension in his jaw. I am tired too, she admitted, her voice small. I am tired of owing the world an explanation for why I am still breathing. Silas looked at her then. His eyes were dark, intense. Then you stop explaining. You are alive. That is the only argument that matters. The wagon hit a rut, jolting them. Their shoulders bumped again. This time, neither of them pulled away. The weather turned violently worse on the ride back. The sleet turned to a heavy, freezing rain that saturated the ground. The dry creek bed they had crossed earlier was now a churning torrent of brown water, fed by flash runoff from the hardpan. Silas pulled the team to a halt at the edge of the wash. The water was high, swirling around the wheels. We have to cross, Silas shouted over the roar of the water. If we wait, it will only get higher. He urged the horses forward. The team balked, ears pinned, but Silas's steady hands guided them in. The water rose to the hubs, then the floorboards. The current pushed hard against the wagon, slewing it sideways. Suddenly, the left front wheel struck a submerged rock. The wagon lurched violently. Lena, caught off guard, was thrown from the seat. She hit the water with a gasp, the freezing cold punching the air from her lungs. The current grabbed her skirt, dragging her down. She thrashed, her boots slipping on the slick river stones. Elena! Silas roared. He did not hesitate. He threw the reins and leaped from the wagon, splashing into the waist-deep water. He fought the current, wading toward her. Lena was struggling to find her footing, the heavy wool of her dress pulling her under. Silas reached her just as she went down. He grabbed her arm, his grip like iron, and hauled her up. She surfaced, gasping, coughing water, clinging to him blindly. He pulled her against his chest, bracing his legs against the current. For a moment, the world narrowed to the roar of the water and the heat of his body against hers. She buried her face in his coat, shaking uncontrollably. Silas held her, one arm wrapped tight around her waist, his hand tangling in her wet hair to hold her head up. Got you, he rasped, his mouth close to her ear. I have got you. The danger was still there. The horses were plunging, the water rising, but in that second, neither moved. The shock of the fall was tangled with something else, a sudden, fierce awareness of the body pressed against them. Lena felt the strength of him, the solid anchor in the chaos. Silas felt the fragility of her and the terrifying surge of instinct to protect her at any cost. He dragged her back to the wagon, heaving her up onto the seat before climbing up beside her. He whipped the horses, shouting them forward. The team lunged, dragging the wagon up the muddy bank and onto solid ground. They did not speak for the rest of the ride. The air between them was electric, charged with the memory of that desperate embrace. Back at the ranch house, the storm raged outside, but the kitchen was warm. Silas had built up the fire until it roared. Clothes were strung on a line near the hearth, steaming as they dried. Lena sat wrapped in a quilt, holding a mug of coffee with both hands to stop the shaking. Her hair was loose, drying in dark waves around her shoulders. Silas stood by the fire, stripped to his undershirt and trousers, rubbing a towel over his head. The restraint that usually governed their interactions was worn thin. The adrenaline of the near drown was fading, leaving behind a raw, exposed nerve. Silas turned to pour himself more coffee. He moved to the table. As he reached for the pot, his hand brushed Lena's. The contact was brief, but it stopped them both. Silas froze. Lena looked up, her eyes wide, dark pupils blown out in the dim light. The silence in the kitchen was heavy, filled with the sound of the fire popping and their own breathing. Silas looked down at her. He saw the curve of her neck, the pulse beating there. He saw a woman who had fought the world and won. Sitting in his kitchen, he felt an ache in his chest that had nothing to do with the cold. It was a wanting, sharp and sudden. He wanted to touch her face. He wanted to tell her that she was the bravest thing he had ever seen. Lena saw the look in his eyes. It was not pity. It was hunger, and it was respect. For the first time in months, she did not feel like a victim. She felt seen. Silas, she whispered. It was the first time she had used his name without a title. Silas's hand twitched. He started to lean in, drawn by a gravity he couldn't fight. Then the wind slammed a shutter against the wall outside, a loud crack like a gunshot. The spell broke. Silas pulled back, clearing his throat roughly. He stepped away from the table, putting distance between them. "You should sleep," he said, his voice strained. You did well today. I will," Lena said, her voice trembling slightly. "Good night, Silas. Good night, Elena." The next day, the weather held cold and gray. Lena, exhausted but driven by a restless energy, threw herself into the books. She needed numbers. She needed logic. She needed something that made sense, because her feelings for the man in the other room made no sense at all. She was cross-referencing the cattle counts from the fall roundup with the current herd estimates. She found a discrepancy, a significant one. According to the tally book kept by the foreman, Shorty had been filling it in since the previous foreman left. There were 50 calves branded in October, but the feed logs and the visual count Silas had done showed only 35. 15 calves. Gone. Lena traced the column of numbers. The dates of the losses coincided with nights when Shorty had been on night watch, nights when fences were mysteriously cut. It wasn't just rustlers from the outside. Someone inside was opening the gate. She sat back, her heart racing. She had to tell Silas. She turned the page to check the date of the stage robbery, just to anchor herself in time. She had a habit of checking dates. And then she froze. She had been staring at the handwriting in the ledger, but her mind drifted back to the man with the ring. The man Vance had called neighbor. She had seen him clearly yesterday in her mind's eye when she told Silas about the robbery. But now, in the safety of the ranch, the memory sharpened. She remembered the ring. Silver, with a turquoise stone cracked down the middle. She had seen that ring on the hand of the rider at the fence line in part 1, but she had also seen it 2 days ago. In town, not on the rider. She had seen it on a man talking to Shorty behind the stables when they first arrived in town. She hadn't registered it then, focused on her nerves. But now the image clicked into place. Shorty knew Vance's rider. Shorty was talking to the man who had killed her mother. The web of corruption wasn't just Vance and Pike. It was here, on the ranch. Lena put a hand over her mouth to stifle a sob. The panic rose, hot and choking. The man who murdered her mother was in league with the man sleeping in the bunkhouse 50 yards away. She was not safe. She was in a nest of vipers. She wanted to run. She wanted to pack her bag and flee into the snow. But where would she go? The snow was deep. The town was hostile. Pike was waiting. She looked at the door to the main house. Silas was in there. Silas, who had pulled her from the river. Silas, who had stood up to the town for her. She swallowed the panic. She forced it down into the dark place where she kept her grief. She would not run. She would fight. And to fight, she needed proof. That evening, Silas called her into the parlor. He looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "Elena," he said. "Yes, sir?" She stood clutching her shawl, her nerves still jangling from her discovery. Silas looked at the floor, then at her. "The tack room. It is too cold, and with everything happening, I do not like you sleeping in the barn alone." Lena waited. "There is a spare room," Silas said, "at the top of the stairs. It was a sewing room once. It is small, but it has a stove and a lock on the door." He looked her in the eye, making sure she understood. "A lock on the inside. You would be safe." Lena hesitated. To move into the house was to cross a line in the eyes of the town. It would confirm every rumor Pike was spreading. It was an intimacy that frightened her almost as much as the cold. But then she thought of Shorty in the bunkhouse. She thought of the ring. She thought of the wolves circling the fence line. And she looked at Silas, this hard, quiet man who offered her a lock for her own door, giving her the power to keep even him out. "I accept," she said softly. Silas nodded, letting out a breath he seemed to have been holding. "Good. It is settled then. I will bring your things up." Lena watched him go. She was no longer just a hired hand. She was an ally. And as the wind howled outside, battering the walls of the ranch, she knew they would need every ounce of trust they could build to survive what was coming. The walls of the ranch house, built from ponderosa pine logs that had cured to the hardness of iron over 30 years, had always seemed impenetrable to Silas Reed. They were thick enough to stop a bullet and tight enough to keep out the worst of the Wyoming wind. But in the weeks since Elena Morales moved into the sewing room at the top of the stairs, the walls felt suddenly thin. The house, once a cavern of silence where Silas existed like a ghost in his own life, became a landscape of small, terrifying sounds. He heard the creak of the floorboards above his head when she paced at night. He heard the soft scratch of her pen in the ledger downstairs when he was trying to read by the fire. He heard the rustle of her skirts as she moved through the kitchen in the gray light of dawn to start the coffee. Proximity was a pressure vessel. It stripped away the ability to hide. They ate breakfast together at the scarred oak table, passing the biscuits and the butter, their hands occasionally brushing, sending a jolt of awareness through Silas that made his war leg ache. They were two people circling a fire, afraid to get too close for fear of burning, yet freezing in the space they maintained. Lena's sleep, which had been so elusive in the freezing tack room, initially deepened in the safety of the house. The lock on her door was a heavy iron bolt that Silas had oiled himself, and the first few nights, she slept the sleep of the dead. But safety has a cruel way of unlocking memory. When the body no longer has to fight the cold, the mind is free to wander back to the places it fled. The nightmares returned in the 3rd week. Silas heard her cry out, a sharp, strangled sound that cut through the ceiling. He lay in his bed downstairs, staring at the dark beams, his hands clenched into fists. He wanted to go to her. He wanted to storm the stairs and wake her, to tell her she was in Crossing Creek, not on a dusty road with blood in her mouth. But he knew that a man bursting into her room in the dark would only be another terror. So he did the only thing he knew how to do. He rose, lit the stove, and brewed coffee strong enough to wake the dead. He left a mug on the bottom step, wrapped in a thick wool blanket, and retreated to the barn before she came down. When he returned hours later, the mug was empty, washed, and drying on the rack. Neither of them spoke of it. It was a kindness that required silence to survive. The threat of Vance and his riders hung over the valley like the smell of ozone before a lightning strike. Silas knew that ledgers and locks were not enough. On a Tuesday afternoon, when the wind had died down enough to hear a voice at 20 paces. Silas called Lena behind the barn. He held his Colt peacemaker in his hand, the metal dull and heavy. "You need to know how to use this," Silas said. He did not dress it up. Lena looked at the gun. She had seen guns before, usually pointed at her or fired by men who laughed while they did it. She crossed her arms, hugging her shawl tight. "I do not like them," she said. "I do not like them either," Silas answered. "But I like being defenseless even less. If they come when I'm out on the range, a lock will only buy you time. This will buy you a life." He held the grip out to her. Lena hesitated, then took it. It was heavier than she expected, cold and smelling of oil and burnt powder. "Hold it with 2 hands, Silas instructed. "Like this." He stepped behind her to correct her stance. He did not mean to step so close, but to guide her elbow. He had to. His chest brushed her back. His hand covered hers on the grip, rough skin against smooth. Lena stopped breathing. The heat of him was sudden and overwhelming. She could feel the steady rhythm of his heart against her shoulder blade. For a moment, the gun was forgotten. The world narrowed to the rough texture of his jacket and the smell of him. Tobacco, leather, and rain. Silas froze. He realized too late that he had breached the perimeter they had so carefully constructed. His hand lingered on hers, his thumb resting near her wrist where her pulse was fluttering like a trapped bird. "Breathe, Elena," he murmured, his voice dropping an octave. "You have to breathe, or you will pull the shot." She took a ragged breath, the air trembling in her lungs. "I am breathing." "Look at the post," Silas said, though he was looking at the stray curl of hair touching her neck. "Squeeze. Do not pull. It should surprise you when it goes off." She squeezed. The gun roared, kicking back hard against her palms. The bottle on the fence post exploded into shards of amber glass. Lena lowered the gun, her ears ringing. She turned to look at him, her face flushed with adrenaline and something else. They were standing inches apart. The echo of the shot faded, leaving a silence that felt heavy and dangerous. Silas looked at her mouth, then forced his gaze up to her eyes. He stepped back, putting 2 feet of cold air between them. "Good," he said, his voice rough. "Keep practicing. I have work to do." He walked away fast, not looking back, leaving Lena standing with a smoking gun, her hands shaking not from the recoil, but from the memory of his touch. The valley was small, and poison spreads fast in small places. The Sunday following the shooting lesson, Silas insisted they go to town for the service. It was a calculated risk. He wanted to show the town that they had nothing to hide. It was a mistake. As they entered the small white clapboard church, the conversation died. Heads turned. The silence was absolute. Silas walked with his head high, guiding Lena to a pew near the back. Mrs. Gable, a pillar of the congregation who ran the bakery, was sitting in the pew. As Lena moved to sit, Mrs. Gable stood up. She gathered her skirts with a dramatic swish, her nose wrinkling as if she had smelled rotting meat. "Come, Martha." "Mrs." Gable said to her daughter, her voice carrying to the rafters. "The air is too thick back here." She pushed past Lena, her hip checking Lena hard enough to make her stumble. Lena caught herself on the pew back, her face burning. She sat down, staring straight ahead at the cross, her spine rigid. Silas sat beside her, his jaw working. He did not look at Mrs. Gable. He looked at the men in the room, daring them to speak. None did. They were cowards who let their women do the cutting. The prejudice did not stay in the church. 2 days later, a drifting ranch hand named Stokes, whom Silas had hired to help repair the wind-damaged roof, made his move. They were eating the noon meal in the bunkhouse. Silas, Lena, Shorty, and Stokes. Stokes was a man with watery eyes and a mouth that was always wet. "So, Duchess," Stokes said, chewing with his mouth open, "that is a nice room you got in the big house. Must be warm." "I am comfortable." "Thank you," Lena said, not looking up from her plate. "I bet." Stokes smirked. "Old man Reed must keep you real warm. How much extra does that cost him? Or do you give a discount for the elderly?" The spoon froze halfway to Lena's mouth. Shorty let out a nervous giggle, then choked it off when he saw Silas. Silas stood up. He did not move fast. He moved with the slow, terrifying inevitability of a landslide. He walked around the table and grabbed Stokes by the back of his collar. He hauled the man out of his chair and threw him toward the door. Stokes crashed into the wall, overturning a bench. "Get your gear," Silas said. His voice was not loud. It was a whisper that carried across the room. "Now hold on," Stokes stammered. "Scrambling up? I was just joking." "You have 5 minutes to be off my land," Silas said. "If I see you on the road after that, I will shoot you for trespassing." Stokes fled. Silas sat back down and picked up his fork. Shorty stared at his plate, terrified. Lena looked at Silas. She saw his hand gripping the fork so hard his knuckles were white. "Thank you," she said softly. Silas did not look at her. "We are short-handed now," he said. "We will have to work later tonight." The pressure mounted. A week later, a buggy with polished red wheels rolled into the yard. Caldwell Vance stepped out, dressed in a suit that cost more than Silas's yearly earnings. He smiled, his teeth white and perfect. Silas met him on the porch. He did not invite him in. "Silas," Vance said, spreading his hands. "You look tired, my friend. I am not your friend." "Vance," Silas said. "What do you want?" "I want to help you." Vance sighed, looking around the yard at the peeling paint and the lean cattle. "This drought. It is a tragedy. I hate to see a veteran like yourself suffer. I am prepared to make you a generous offer for the deed. Cash. Enough to move east. Maybe take the girl with you. Start fresh where people do not know your business." He glanced at the window where Lena was watching. His smile turned predatory. "She is a liability. Silas, a lovely one, but a liability. You are sinking. Let me be the lifeboat. I am not selling," Silas said. "Not to you. Not to anyone." Vance's smile remained fixed, but his eyes went dead. "That is unfortunate. The bank might not be as patient as I am. And accidents happen so easily out here. Barns burn, wells go dry, men disappear. Get off my land," Silas said. Vance tipped his hat. "Think about it. The offer expires when the snow flies. The attack, when it came, was not physical. It was social. And it was orchestrated by Deputy Pike. Supplies were critical again." Silas and Lena drove the wagon to the mercantile. Ignoring the stairs, they were selecting winter boots. Lena's were worn through. When Deputy Pike walked in, followed by 2 men from the saloon, Miller, the shopkeeper, suddenly looked nervous. He wiped his hands on his apron. "Is there a problem, Deputy?" Miller asked, his voice high. "I believe there is," Pike said. He looked at Lena. "We have had reports of theft. Miss Morales, small items, ribbons, tinned peaches, things a woman of your limited means might desire but cannot afford." "I have stolen nothing," Lena said, her voice steady, though her heart hammered against her ribs. Pike smiled. "Then you won't mind if we check your pockets?" He reached for her. The implication was clear. He was going to put his hands on her. Here, in front of the town, under the guise of the law. A crowd had gathered at the window, watching. They wanted a show. They wanted the dirty woman to be shamed. Lena slapped his hand away. "Do not touch me." "Resisting an officer?" Pike tutted. "That is a jail offense. Darling." Silas stepped between them. He held a leather-bound book in his hand. The ranch ledger. He slammed it onto the counter. The sound cracked like a whip. "Open it," Silas commanded Miller. Miller jumped. What? "Open to page 52. Read the entry for today." Miller opened the book with shaking hands. He read aloud. "November 3rd. Boots, flour, coffee. Cash on hand. $20. All items paid in full." Silas looked at Pike. "She tracks every cent, every grain of flour, every nail. She does not need to steal your cheap trinkets. Deputy, she has more integrity in her little finger than this whole town has in its Sunday best." He turned to Miller. "Count the cash." Silas threw a gold eagle onto the counter. It spun and settled. Miller looked at the coin, then at Pike. The deputy's face had turned a mottled red. The accusation had collapsed before it could even begin. Pike glared at Silas. "You are making a mistake. Reed, you are choosing the wrong side. I am choosing the side that doesn't require me to sleep with one eye open," Silas said. He took the boots and handed them to Lena. "Let's go." They walked out. Pike stood fuming, but the victory had a cost. As they left, Miller called out, his voice shaking, "Mr. Reed!" Silas stopped. "No more credit," Miller said, looking at his shoes. "Cash only from now on, and maybe you take your business to the next county." The town had closed its doors. Silas nodded once, accepting the sentence, and helped Lena into the wagon. The ride home was silent for a long time. The sky was turning a bruised purple over the mountains. "I never asked you to do this," Lena said finally. Her voice was thick with unshed tears. "I never asked you to lose your standing for me. You should have let him search me. I had nothing. Silas kept his eyes on the road, and let him put his hands on you? Let him strip your dignity for sport? No." "But you are losing everything," Lena cried, turning to him. "Your credit, your friends, your safety." "For what? For a stranger?" Silas pulled the horses to a stop. He turned to her. The anger in his eyes surprised her. "You are not a stranger. Elena, not anymore." He took a breath, the cold air hissing through his teeth. "And I am not doing this for you. Do not flatter yourself. I am doing it because it is right. Because for 20 years I have watched men like Vance and Pike take what they want because good men were too busy being safe to stop them. I am done being safe." Lena looked at him, stunned. She saw the fire in him, the iron that the war had forged and the grief had tempered. Silas snapped the reins. "Now wrap up. The wind is rising." They were checking the herd in the south pasture 3 days later when the crack of a rifle shattered the afternoon. Dirt kicked up inches from Silas's horse. A second shot whined past Lena's ear. "Down!" Silas roared. He grabbed the bridle of her horse and dragged them both toward a dry wash, a cut bank where the earth had eroded away, leaving a 4-foot wall of clay. They slid off the horses and tumbled into the ditch just as a third shot took a chunk out of the saddle horn on Silas's mount. The horses bolted, running for the trees. Silas pushed Lena down into the dirt, covering her body with his own. He had his rifle out, scanning the ridge line. "Stay down," he hissed. Lena lay pressed into the frozen earth, Silas's heavy weight shielding her. She could smell the dust on his coat and the sharp tang of gun oil. Her heart was beating so fast it felt like a hummingbird trapped in her chest. Silas fired 2 shots over the lip of the bank. He waited. Silence. "They are testing us," Silas whispered. "They want to see if we will run." He looked down at her. His face was streaked with mud, his eyes fierce and alive. The adrenaline had stripped away the awkwardness, the restraint, the careful distance. There was only survival. "Are you hit?" he demanded, his hands checking her arms, her shoulders. "No," she gasped. "No." His hand stopped on her shoulders. He was breathing hard. She was staring up at him, her lips parted, her eyes wide with the terror of death and the shock of life. The shift was tectonic. The fear evaporated, replaced by a sudden, blinding need. Silas looked at her mouth. He made a low sound in his throat, a growl of frustration and desire, and then he kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss. It was desperate. It tasted of dust and danger. It was the collision of 2 people who had been starving for so long they had forgotten what hunger felt like. Lena's hands came up, gripping the lapels of his coat, pulling him closer. For a moment, the gunfire, the ranch, the prejudice, it all vanished. There was only the heat of him and the cold ground. Then Silas pulled back. He gasped, resting his forehead against hers. His eyes closed. He was shaking. "I should not have done that," he whispered. Lena opened her eyes. She reached up and touched his face, her fingers tracing the scar on his jaw. "Do not apologize," she said fiercely. "Do not you dare apologize." Silas looked at her. He saw the truth in her eyes. He nodded slowly. "Okay," he said. "Okay." They lay there for another hour until the sun dipped low and they were sure the shooters were gone. They walked the 3 miles back to the ranch in the dark. not touching, but the air between them had changed forever. That night, in the safety of the kitchen, they set the boundaries. "I cannot promise you a future," Silas said, staring into his coffee cup. "I might not have a ranch by spring. I might be dead. I am not asking for promises," Lena said. She was sitting across from him, her hand resting near his on the table. "Promises are for people who think they have time. We have now." Silas looked at her. "I want you. Elena, I have wanted you since the day you pulled that gun on the fence post, but I will not take what I cannot keep, and I will not use you to forget my own ghosts." "I am not a distraction," Lena said, "and I am not fragile." She took a breath. She needed him to know. She needed to clear the air before they could go forward. "You asked me once how I survived," she said quietly. Silas went still. "I told you I hid. That was true. But I did not just hide. I crawled under the bodies of the other passengers. Mrs. Holloway. She was heavy. She bled on me. I lay there for 3 hours, playing dead, listening to them go through the pockets of the men they killed." Her voice didn't waver, but tears slipped down her face. "When the marshal came, Pike came, he pulled me out. I was covered in blood that wasn't mine. He looked at me and he said, 'Only a whore or a coward survives this. You must be dirty, girl.'" She looked at Silas, defying him to agree. "I washed for 3 days. I scrubbed my skin until it bled, but I could not get his voice off me." Silas reached across the table. He took her hand. His grip was hard, painful, anchoring. "He was wrong," Silas said. His voice was a rumble of ancient anger. "You did what you had to do to live. There is no shame in living." He looked at the fire. "I was at Antietam. We were ordered to burn a farmhouse. There were people inside, snipers, they said, but when the roof came down, he stopped, his throat working. I have heard their screams every night for 20 years. I thought I deserved to be alone. I thought if I let myself care about anyone, the fire would come for them too." Lena squeezed his hand. "We are not our scars. Silas, we are the ones who heal around them." They sat there as the fire died down, 2 broken things fitting their sharp edges together to make something whole. They did not go upstairs together. They did not need to. The intimacy of the truth was far more naked than skin. The next morning, Lena was sorting through a pile of papers she had found in an old trunk in the attic, records Silas had kept of land notices. She was looking for a bill of sale for a horse when she saw it. A public land notice from the county seat. It announced the auction of the Miller Ranch, neighbors to the south who had abandoned their claim. Lena frowned. She remembered the Millers. They hadn't abandoned the claim. They had been driven off by a fire. She looked at the date. The notice was dated before the fire. "Silas," she called out. Silas came in from the porch. "What is it?" "Look at this." She pointed to the date. "And look at the signature. It says witnessed by Deputy H. Pike. And here, the name of the claimant. It is misspelled. Mylar instead of Miller." Silas leaned over, studying the paper. His eyes narrowed. "It is a forgery," he said. "A sloppy one. They file the notice of abandonment before they even drive the people out. Pike signs it as a witness. Vance buys the claim for pennies on the dollar because no one else knows it is for sale. It is theft," Lena said. "Legalized theft." Silas slammed his hand on the table. "This is it. This is the proof. If we can get this to the circuit judge in Denver." He never finished the sentence. Outside, the horses began to scream. Silas's head snapped up. Smoke. He ran to the door and threw it open. The night was lit up with a terrifying orange glow. The barn was burning. "No!" Silas shouted. They ran into the yard. The heat was a physical blow. The dry timber of the barn, seasoned by years of drought, had gone up like a torch. The flames were already licking at the roof where the winter feed was stored. "The horses!" Lena screamed. Silas grabbed a blanket from the porch and dipped it in the water trough. "Stay back!" he yelled at her. He ran into the burning structure. Lena didn't listen. She grabbed a bucket. She ran to the pump. Silas emerged a moment later, leading the terrified team of work horses, his coat smoking. He slapped their rumps, sending them galloping into the dark pasture. He turned back. The feed. The winter hay. It was too late. The roof groaned and collapsed with a shower of sparks that lit the valley floor for a mile. The heat drove them back, scorching their eyebrows. They stood helplessly by the corral, watching their winter survival turn to ash. The fire roared, consuming the hay, the tools, the tech. Silas fell to his knees. He watched the flames reflect in the water trough. He looked defeated, small. Lena dropped the bucket. She walked over to him and knelt in the mud and ash. She wrapped her arms around him, pulling his head against her shoulder. He was shaking, violent tremors racking his body. He looked up at her, his face streaked with soot. "They took it," he whispered. "They took the winter." Lena held him tighter. She looked at the fire, and her eyes were dry and hard as flint. "They took the barn. Silas, they did not take us." She leaned close to his ear, whispering the truth that terrified her even as she spoke it. "But we cannot stay here. We cannot outrun men like this forever. We have to fight." In the orange light of the dying fire, Silas Reed held on to Elena Morales. And for the first time, he let someone else hold him up. Winter did not come to the valley. It seized it. The snow began 3 days after the fire, not in soft flakes, but in hard, driving pellets that hissed like iron filings against the scorched logs of the ranch house. The wind sharpened itself on the peaks of the Tetons before screaming down into the basin, stripping the warmth from the air until a man could freeze in the time it took to saddle a horse. Silas Reed and Elena Morales lived in a world that had shrunk to the radius of the heat thrown by the kitchen stove. The loss of the barn was a wound that refused to close. They had managed to herd the surviving horses into a rough lean-to built against the leeward side of the house, patching the roof with a salvaged tin and rawhide. Every morning was a battle to break the ice on the trough, the water freezing again before the animals could finish drinking. The cattle suffered. They drifted against the fence lines, their coats matted with ice, heads low against the gale. Silas rode out daily, wrapped in buffalo hides, his face a mask of frost, to chop hay from the few stack yards that had escaped the arsonist's torch. He returned in the evenings gray with exhaustion, his limp pronounced, his hands curled into permanent claws from gripping the reins. Lena worked the house and the lean-to. She rationed the flour and the coffee with a miser's precision. She learned to bank the fire so it would hold coals through the long, howling nights. The ranch hands were gone. Shorty had vanished the morning after the fire, fear finally outweighing his hunger. And the others had drifted onto spreads where the barns didn't burn. It was just the two of them now. The isolation forced a rhythm upon them, a quiet synchronization of survival. They moved around each other in the small kitchen like parts of the same mechanism. When Silas reached for the coffee pot, Lena had already moved it to the trivet. When Lena shivered while washing dishes, Silas was already putting a log on the fire. They spoke little. Words took energy, and they had none to spare. But in the silence, something profound was knitting together. It was a partnership stripped of all artifice. There was no room for charm or pretense when you were melting snow for washing water or sharing the last heel of stale bread. One night, the wind was particularly vicious, shaking the house until the lantern flame danced in its glass chimney. They sat by the stove, the only light in the room. Silas was oiling his holster leather. Lena was mending a tear in his heavy coat. They were sitting close to share the warmth, their chairs angled toward the iron grate. Lena let her hands drop to her lap, the needle still. She looked at Silas's hands, scarred, stained with oil, the knuckles swollen from the cold. She thought of how those hands had pulled her from the river. She thought of how they had guided her aim on the fence post. Without looking at him, she reached out. She placed her hand on the arm of his chair, palm up. It was a question. It was an offering. Silas stopped his work. He looked at her hand. It was rougher now than when she had arrived. The nails short, the skin chapped red. But to him, it looked like the only gentle thing left in the world. Slowly, deliberately, he reached out and covered her hand with his. His palm was calloused and warm. He did not squeeze. He simply rested his hand there, a heavy, protective weight. Lena let out a breath she didn't know she had been holding. She turned her hand over, interlacing her fingers with his. The sensation was electric, not the sharp shock of static, but the deep, grounding hum of a current finding its path. They sat like that for an hour, listening to the wind hunt for cracks in the walls. The desire that rose between them was not the frantic heat they had felt in the ditch during the ambush. It was slower, deeper. It terrified Lena because it was not just a hunger for his body. It was a reliance on his soul. She realized, with a jolt of panic, that she trusted him. And, in her life, trust had always been the precursor to loss. Silas felt the fear in her grip, the slight tremor in her fingers. He did not pull away. He held on, anchoring her to the earth, anchoring her to him. "We will endure this," Silas said. His voice was low, rasping over the silence. "I know," Lena whispered. "The blow, when it came, did not come from the weather. It came from the law. They had been forced to ride into Crossing Creek. The salt was gone, and without salt, they could not cure the meat from the steer Silas had been forced to slaughter. It was a risk, but starvation was a certainty if they stayed. The town looked gray and huddled under the winter sky. Smoke pumped from chimneys, and the streets were empty of all but the most desperate. Silas parked the wagon in front of the mercantile, his eyes scanning the rooftops, his hand near the flap of his coat where his Colt rested. "Stay in the wagon," Silas ordered. "I will be 2 minutes." "I am not a child." "Silas," Lena said, shivering under her shawl. "I can help carry." Silas looked at her. He saw the defiance that kept her spine straight even when she was trembling with cold. He nodded. "Quickly, then." They were stepping onto the boardwalk when the door to the sheriff's office opened. Deputy Harlan Pike stepped out, followed by 2 men who wore badges that looked too new to be official. A small crowd began to gather, drawn by the prospect of trouble like vultures to a carcass. "Elena Morales," Pike called out. His voice was cheerful, a jarring sound in the gray street. Lena stopped. Silas stepped in front of her, his body a shield. "Walk away." "Pike," Silas warned. Pike held up a piece of paper. It flapped in the biting wind. "I'm afraid I cannot do that. Mr. Reed, I have a warrant here, issued by the circuit judge in Denver. Or so the paperwork says." Silas narrowed his eyes. "Warrant for what?" "Complicity," Pike said, savoring the word. "It seems a witness has come forward, one of the men we hanged for the stage robbery. Before he died, he confessed that the girl was in on it, said she signaled the driver to stop, said she was the inside man." "That is a lie," Lena said, stepping out from behind Silas. Her voice rang clear, though her stomach was twisting into knots. "You know that is a lie." Pike shrugged. "I do not know anything. Darling, I just follow the paper. And the paper says I have to take you into custody until the circuit judge arrives in spring." Spring was 4 months away. Silas's hand moved toward his coat. "Do not," Pike said sharply. The 2 men behind him leveled double-barreled shotguns at Silas's chest. Silas froze. He calculated the odds. He could kill Pike. He might get one of the deputies. But the second shotgun would cut Lena in half. "I will go to the judge," Silas said, his voice deadly calm. "I will bring the station master. I will bring the records." "You do that," Pike said. "But until then, she is a guest of the county." He reached out and grabbed Lena's arm. This time, when Silas lunged, the deputies racked the hammers of their guns. "No!" Lena shouted. She looked at Silas, her eyes wide with fear but pleading. "Silas, no! They will kill you! Please!" Silas stopped. He stood shaking with the effort of restraint, his eyes burning with a hate that could have melted the snow. "I will get you out," he promised her. "I swear it." Pike laughed. He dragged Lena toward the jailhouse. The crowd watched. They did not jeer this time. They simply watched with the dead-eyed curiosity of people who were glad it wasn't them. Lena held her head high, refusing to stumble, refusing to give Pike the satisfaction of her tears. Even as the heavy door slammed shut, separating her from the only safety she had ever known. The jail was a stone box at the back of the marshal's office. It was unheated, damp, and smelled of urine and old despair. There was a single high window with iron bars that let in a square of gray light and a draft that cut to the bone. Lena sat on the narrow cot, pulling her shawl tight. The cold was an immediate physical assault, but the shame was worse. Pike had left her there with a smirk, telling her she finally looked like she belonged. For the first 2 days, she paced. She rubbed her arms to keep the blood moving. She refused the watery gruel Pike brought, terrified it was drugged or poisoned. She could hear the men in the office laughing, playing cards, telling stories about women they had broken. She felt the old darkness clawing at her. The voice of the badge-wearing man from the robbery whispered in her ear. Dirty, complicit, whore. She fought it. She squeezed her eyes shut and summoned the memory of the firelight on Silas's face. She summoned the weight of his hand on hers. I am not what they say I am, she whispered to the stone walls. I am Elena Morales. I can read. I can shoot. I am loved. On the 3rd night, a noise at the window startled her. A shadow blocked the moonlight. A hand reached through the bars, holding a bundle wrapped in a checked cloth. Take it, a voice whispered. It was a woman's voice, old and cracked like dried leather. Lena moved to the window. Who is it? Hattie Mercer. The voice hissed. Just take it, child. Pike is at the saloon. Lena took the bundle. It was warm. Inside was a dense loaf of cornbread, a chunk of roasted beef, and a small flask of hot coffee. Why? Lena asked, gripping the bars. Because I buried 3 husbands, the widow Mercer whispered. And I know the difference between a bad woman and a woman surrounded by bad men. You eat that. Keep your strength up. Silas Reed is turning this valley upside down. He has not forgotten you. The widow vanished into the night. Lena sank to the floor, clutching the warm food to her chest, and wept, not from despair, but from the sudden, overwhelming shock of kindness. Silas did not sleep. He did not eat. He moved with the terrifying energy of a man who has nothing left to lose. He tried the town judge first. Judge Holloway was a man with a red nose and a weakness for Vance's whiskey. He refused to see Silas. Silas kicked the door open. He slammed a sheaf of papers onto the desk, the clean books Lena had kept, the receipts, the character references he had ridden 40 miles to get from the previous town where she had worked. She is innocent. Holloway, Silas growled, and you know it. This warrant is ink on a lie. Holloway trembled, wiping his mouth. It is out of my hands. Read. It is a federal matter now. Pike says. Pike is a dog on Vance's leash, Silas roared. He was thrown out by the bailiff, threatened with arrest himself. Doors closed in his face. The merchant, Miller, turned his back. The preacher looked at the ground. Fear had silenced the town more effectively than any gag. Silas realized that the law in this valley was a weapon, not a shield. He could not fight Pike with logic. He had to fight him with leverage. He went back to the ranch, but not to sleep. He went to the spot where he had found the tracks of the rider with the ring. He followed them backward. He spent days in the saddle, tracking the movements of Vance's men through the snow. He found where they camped. He found where they met with the foreman of the Double Vi. And he found something else. He found the ranch hand, Stokes, the man he had fired for insulting Lena. Stokes was working a line shack for Vance now, drunk and loose-lipped. Silas waited for him in the dark. When Stokes came out to relieve himself, Silas was there. He did not use his gun. He used his hands, and the terrifying threat of his silence. Stokes broke. He babbled everything he knew. He told Silas about the forged warrant. He told him who had signed it. Not a judge, but a clerk in Vance's pocket who had a stamp stolen from the courthouse. Silas dragged Stokes to the widow's house. He made him write it down. Mrs. Mercer witnessed it. Then Silas rode back to town. He walked into the marshal's office at noon. He did not have his gun drawn, but his coat was unbuttoned. Pike was sitting at the desk, cleaning his fingernails with a knife. I told you. Read, Pike said, not looking up. Spring. Silas threw the paper onto the desk. It was the confession from Stokes. Read it, Silas said. Pike glanced at it. He laughed. The word of a drunk? Against a deputy. Good luck. I do not need luck, Silas said. I have sent a copy of this to the U.S. Marshal in Cheyenne. By Ryder. He left yesterday. Pike went still. The knife stopped moving. You are bluffing. The pass is snowed in. The southern pass is. Silas lied smoothly. The rider took the high trail. He will be there by tomorrow. If I am not there to meet the marshal with Elena, he has instructions to ride in here with a federal posse and hang every man wearing a badge who cannot prove his appointment. Silas leaned over the desk. Kidnapping under color of law is a hanging offense. Harlan, do you trust Vance enough to swing for him? Pike looked at Silas. He looked at the paper. He saw the absolute, granite certainty. In Silas's eyes, he didn't know if the rider was real, but he knew Silas Reed was the kind of man who would burn the world down to get what he wanted. Pike swallowed. He stood up. He took the keys from his belt and threw them on the desk. Get her out, Pike spat. But tell her to watch her back. I will tell her to watch yours, Silas said, swiping the keys. The sound of the key in the lock was the loudest thing Lena had ever heard. The door swung open. Silas stood there, backlit by the office lantern. He looked like a ghost, gaunt, unshaven, his eyes hollowed out by exhaustion. Elena, he breathed. Lena stood up. Her legs were weak. She stumbled toward him. Silas caught her. He wrapped his arms around her, crushing her to him. The smell of the jail, the cold, the fear, it all washed away in the scent of him. I told you, he whispered into her hair. I told you I would come. Take me home. She sobbed dryly. Please, just take me home. The ride back was slow. The snow had stopped, leaving the world suspended in a white, frozen silence. Back at the ranch, the house was cold. The fire dead. Silas rebuilt it with shaking hands while Lena sat wrapped in blankets, staring at the flames as they licked the wood. She felt brittle, like a piece of glass that had been tapped one too many times. She felt dirty, just as Pike had intended. Silas brought her hot water. He filled the tin tub in front of the fire. He set out a bar of soap and a clean towel. Then he turned to go upstairs, to give her privacy. Silas, Lena said. Her voice was a rasp. He stopped. Yes? Do not go. Silas turned. He looked at her. He saw the shame she was fighting, the way she was trying to scrub Pike's gaze off her skin with her mind. I do not want to be alone, she said. I am tired of being alone. Silas walked back to her. He knelt beside the chair. I am here. Elena, I am not going anywhere. Lena looked at him. She reached out and touched his face, his rough beard, the line of his jaw. She needed to feel him. She needed to know that her body was her own again, and she wanted to give it to him, not as a trade, not as a desperate act of survival, but as a choice, a defiant, terrifying choice. She stood up. The blanket fell away. She wore her shift, stained with the grime of the jail. Help me, she whispered. Silas stood. His hands trembled as he reached for the ties of her shift. He undid them with a reverence that made Lena's breath catch. He peeled the fabric away, leaving her standing in the firelight, shivering not from cold, but from exposure. Silas did not look at her with lust. He looked at her with a profound, aching worship. He traced the line of her shoulder with his thumb. You are beautiful, he said, his voice thick. You are the most beautiful thing on this earth. Lena stepped into the water. She washed the jail from her skin. Silas helped her, taking the cloth and washing her back, his touch firm and claiming. When she stepped out, he wrapped her in the clean towel. He lifted her into his arms, carrying her not to the sewing room, but to the large bed in the corner of the room, the one he had slept in alone for a decade. He laid her down. He undressed quickly, the firelight catching the scars on his chest and thigh. When he lay beside her, the heat of him was a shock. Lena moved into him. She pressed her skin against his, needing the friction to prove she was alive. She kissed him, and it was a kiss of reclamation. She took his hands and placed them on her waist, on her hips. Touch me, she commanded softly. Make me forget him. Make me forget them all. The intimacy that followed was slow and fierce. It was a conversation without words, a desperate affirmation of life in the face of the winter and the wolves. When Silas entered her, Lena cried out, not in pain, but in release. She held on to him, digging her fingers into his shoulders, anchoring herself in the storm. For the first time in years, she was not hiding. She was completely, terrifyingly found. Morning brought a cold sun and a new resolve. They lay in bed. The fire burned down to embers. Lena rested her head on Silas's chest. Listening to his heartbeat, she felt different. The brittleness was gone, replaced by a core of steel. "We cannot stay on the defensive," Silas said, staring at the ceiling. "Pike let you go because he was scared of the federal marshal. But when he finds out I bluffed, when he finds out there is no rider, he will come back." Lena finished. "And he will not bring a warrant next time. He will bring fire." "We have to finish this," Silas said. "We have to cut the head off the snake." Lena sat up. She pulled the quilt around her. "We need help," she said. "We cannot do it alone." Silas nodded. "I know. They spent the day riding. They did not ride to the sheriff. They rode to the people the town had forgotten or dismissed. They went to the schoolhouse. Mr. Thorne, the teacher, was a man who had been threatened by Vance for teaching the children of Mexican laborers. He had a printing press in his basement. He agreed to print handbills exposing the land fraud, if they could find the proof. They went to the widow Mercer. She stood on her porch, a shotgun in her hand. "I have been waiting for you to ask," she said, spitting into the snow. "My husband's brother is the clerk at the feed store. He hates Vance. He says Vance is cooking the books on the supply chain. And they found the ranch hand, the one who had testified to the fence cutting but had been silenced. Silas found him hiding in a trapper's cabin. Silas offered him protection and a job for life. The man, guilt-ridden and freezing, agreed to talk. But talk was not enough. They needed paper. That night, back at the ranch, Lena and Silas pored over the information the clerk had whispered to the widow. "Vance brings his supplies in from the railhead once a month," Lena said, tracing a map on the table. "He has a private warehouse near the tracks. The clerk says Vance keeps a separate set of books there. The real books, the ones that show who he pays off. If we can get those books," Silas said, "we have him. We have Pike. We have the judge. But the railhead is 3 days' ride," Lena said, "through the high pass, in this snow. And Vance's riders patrol that road," Silas added. They looked at each other. The risk was absolute. If they were caught, they would be buried in the snow, and no one would ever know. "But if we stay here, we die slowly," Lena said. "I am done dying slowly." Silas reached across the table and took her hand. The connection between them was solid now, tested by fire and ice. "We leave at dawn," he said. Lena nodded. She went to the loose floorboard under the bed where they hid their few valuables. She pulled out the gun Silas had taught her to use. She checked the cylinder. It was full. She looked at Silas. She was no longer the girl who had arrived with a carpetbag and a plea for a chance. She was a woman who had proven herself and who had found something worth killing for. "Let's go get the truth," she said. "Outside." The wind howled, promising a deathly cold. But inside, they were ready. The tide had turned. Now, the hunt began. The wind did not blow. It screamed. It tore down from the granite peaks of the high country, stripping the heat from the air until the world felt less like a landscape and more like a tomb of white marble. Silas Reed and Elena Morales moved through this frozen purgatory with the desperate determination of wolves. They had abandoned the wagon 20 miles back when the snowdrift choked the pass, turning the wheels into useless anchors. Now, they were on horseback, the animals wading chest-deep in powder, their breath pluming in thick, gray clouds that froze instantly on their muzzles. The cold was an active, malevolent force. It sought out the gaps in their wool coats, the seams of their gloves, the cracks in their boots. Lena's lips were split and bleeding, the blood freezing into dark scabs before it could drip. Her fingers were numb claws wrapped around the reins, devoid of feeling. Silas rode ahead, breaking the trail. He was a darker shape against the blinding white. His shoulders hunched against the gale. Every hour, he stopped to check on her, He did not speak. Words were a waste of precious warmth, but he would reach out and rub her arms, his eyes searching hers for the glassy look that signaled the final surrender to the freeze. The landscape was an indifferent judge. The black pines stood like silent sentinels, watching them struggle. The sky was a flat, featureless sheet of iron. There was no mercy here, only the brutal arithmetic of survival. Keep moving or die. They camped that night in a hollow beneath the roots of a fallen cedar. There was no fire. A fire would be a beacon to the men hunting them. Vance's riders were behind them. They had seen the dark specks moving on the ridge line 2 hours ago. Silas fed the horses the last of the grain from his saddlebags. He huddled next to Lena under a shared buffalo robe, their bodies pressed together for warmth. "They are close," Lena whispered. Her voice was a dry rasp. "They will have to stop for the night, too," Silas murmured, his mouth close to her ear. "Even Vance's money cannot buy off this frost." He rubbed her hands between his, trying to push blood back into her fingertips. Lena looked at him in the gloom. His beard was frosted with ice, his eyes red-rimmed and sunken. He looked like a man carving himself out of granite. "We will make the railhead by tomorrow noon," he promised. "If the pass is clear." Lena said, "It will be clear." Silas said, "It has to be." The morning brought a stillness that was more terrifying than the wind. The sound carried for miles in the thin, brittle air. They were traversing a narrow ledge of rock, the drop-off disappearing into a white abyss on their left. When Silas suddenly held up a hand, he pulled his horse to a halt. "Listen." Lena strained her ears. At first, she heard nothing but the blood rushing in her own head. Then, she heard it, the crunch of snow, the jingle of a bit below them. "Not behind. They are cutting us off," Silas hissed. They took the lower switchback. He looked around wildly. There was nowhere to run. The trail ahead was exposed. To go back was to ride into the main party. "Up," Silas ordered, pointing to a fissure in the rock face above them. It was a shallow cave, little more than a crack in the geology, screened by a twisted juniper. They dismounted. Silas slapped the horses on the rump, sending them clattering down the trail ahead. It was a sacrifice that tore at him, but the animals would draw the fire. He grabbed Lena and hauled her up the rock face. They scrambled into the fissure just as the riders came into view below. There were 3 of them, heavily armed, wrapped in furs, riding with the slumped posture of men who were miserable and dangerous. Silas and Lena pressed themselves into the back of the crevice. It was shallow, barely 3 feet deep. Silas pulled Lena against him, his back to the stone, shielding her with his body. He pulled the buffalo robe over them, blending with the shadows. The riders stopped directly below their position. "I heard hooves," one man said. His voice drifted up, clear and sharp. "Tracks are fresh," another grunted. They pushed the horses hard. Silas felt Lena tremble against him. He tightened his grip, his arm like an iron band across her chest. He pressed his face into the curve of her neck, breathing slowly, rhythmically, willing her heart to match his. In the darkness under the robe, the proximity was overwhelming. The fear of death stripped away the last layers of reserve. Lena buried her face in Silas's coat. She could smell the sweat, the leather, the gun oil. She felt the heavy thud of his heart against her ribs. It was a terrifying intimacy. They were hunted animals, frozen and exhausted, yet the heat between them was undeniable. It was the desperate, furious desire of life asserting itself against the void. Lena clamped her hand over her mouth to stifle the sound of her own ragged breathing. Silas's hand found her waist, holding her, grounding her. "I am here," his touch said. "I have you." The riders lingered. One lit a pipe. The smell of tobacco drifted up, a taunting reminder of comfort. "They cannot get far on blown horses," the leader finally said. "Let's move." The crunch of hooves receded. Silas and Lena did not move for a long time. They stayed locked together in the stone womb, sharing the silence, afraid to break the contact that had kept them from screaming. When they finally pulled apart, their eyes met in the gloom. There was no need for words. The promise had been made in the dark. They belonged to each other now, bound by the terror and the heat. They walked the last 10 miles. When they stumbled into the town of Silverton, the county seat, they looked like apparitions. Silas was limping badly. His war legs seized up from the cold. Lena was gray-faced, her eyes burning with a feverish light. But they had the ledger copies strapped to Silas's chest beneath his shirt. They went straight to the federal marshal's office. It was a brick building with a pot-belly stove that roared in the corner, a luxury that made Lena weep with pain as the blood rushed back into her frozen extremities. Marshal Davis was a man of procedure. He wore spectacles and a weary expression. He looked at the disheveled couple, then at the papers Silas slammed onto his desk. "This is serious," Davis said, adjusting his glasses. "Forgery, arson, conspiracy to defraud the government." "It is a war," Silas rasped. "And Vance is winning it because he bought your local law." Davis looked at the papers again. "I need to verify these signatures. I need to depose the witnesses. The circuit judge is in session, but his docket is full. Make room," Lena said. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the room like a blade. "We rode through hell to bring you this. Make room." Davis looked at her. He saw the cracked lips, the frostbite on her cheeks, the steel in her spine. He nodded slowly. "I will speak to the judge." But justice in the West moved at the speed of money, and Caldwell Vance had a great deal of money. By the time the hearing was convened 2 days later, Vance had arrived by train, fresh, shaved, and flanked by a lawyer from Denver named Mr. Sterling. Sterling wore a silk vest and a smile that did not reach his eyes. The courtroom was packed. The story of the lovers on the run had spread, and the gallery was full of curious townsfolk who wanted to see the woman who had caused so much trouble. Silas sat at the plaintiff's table, stiff in a borrowed suit that was too tight across the shoulders. Lena sat beside him, wearing a simple gray dress the widow Mercer had sent for her. She kept her hands folded in her lap to hide their trembling. Sterling did not attack the evidence. He attacked the source. He paced in front of the witness box where Lena sat. "Miss Morales," Sterling began, his voice smooth as oil. "You say you found these discrepancies in the books. But you have no formal training in accountancy. Do you? My father taught me." Lena said, "Ah, your father. And tell me, before you came to Mr. Reed's ranch, what was your profession?" "I survived," Lena said. Sterling chuckled. "A survivor? Yes, we have heard the stories. You survived a stage robbery where 3 men died. You survived a winter storm alone. You seem to have a talent for being the only one left standing. Some might call that suspicious." "Objection," Silas growled, half rising from his chair. "Sit down." "Mr. Reed," the judge warned. Sterling turned to the jury. "This woman is a drifter, a foreigner with no roots in this community. She arrives with nothing, ingratiates herself with a lonely widower, and suddenly discovers a conspiracy that just happens to target the most respected businessman in the valley?" He leaned in close to Lena. "Isn't it true, Miss Morales, that you are simply a woman looking for a payout? That you seduced Mr. Reed and filled his head with these fantasies to hide your own past?" The courtroom murmured. The insult hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. It was the weapon Pike had used, sharpened to a legal point. Lena looked at Sterling. She looked at the crowd. She saw the judgment in their eyes, the same judgment she had seen in the church, in the mercantile. She did not look down. "I am not ashamed," she said. Her voice was not loud, but it silenced the room. "I am not ashamed that I survived the robbery. I crawled through the blood of strangers to live. I am not ashamed that I worked for Silas Reed. I worked until my hands bled to save his ranch, and I am not ashamed that I love him." She looked directly at Vance, who sat smirking in the front row. "You call me foreign, you call me untrustworthy, but I am not the one stealing land from widows. I am not the one burning barns in the night. I am the one telling the truth, and the truth does not care where I was born or how poor I am. It only cares about what you did." She pointed a shaking finger at the ledger on the evidence table. "Those numbers do not lie. You can paint me however you want, sir, but you cannot erase the ink." Sterling opened his mouth to retort, but the door at the back of the courtroom banged open. Marshal Davis walked in. Beside him walked a young man, twisting his hat in his hands. It was Billy, the younger brother of Vance's foreman. The ranch hand Silas had tracked down. "I have a witness." "Your Honor," the marshal announced. Billy took the stand. He was terrified. He looked at Vance, who stared at him with cold fury. But then Billy looked at Lena. He saw her sitting there, head high, taking the blows for everyone who had been too afraid to speak. He broke. He told them everything. He told them about the orders to cut the fences. He told them about the night the barn burned, how his brother had poured the kerosene. He told them about the payoffs to Deputy Pike. The courtroom erupted. The judge hammered his gavel, but the sound was lost in the roar of a town realizing it had been played. Retaliation was swift and desperate. That evening, Silas and Lena left the hotel to meet the marshal. They walked down the boardwalk, the snow crunching under their boots. The town was dark, the gas lamps flickering in the wind. Silas sensed it before he saw it, a shadow detaching itself from an alleyway. "Down!" Silas shouted. He shoved Lena into a doorway just as a gunshot cracked. Silas spun, drawing his peacemaker. A second shot rang out. Silas grunted, stumbling back, clutching his side. He fired back. 3 shots, rapid and deafening. A figure in the alley cried out and fell. Silas dropped to one knee. The snow beneath him turned dark. "Silas!" Lena screamed. She fell to her knees beside him, her hands pressing against his coat. "I am all right," Silas gritted out, his face pale. "It is just a scratch." It was more than a scratch. The bullet had caught him in the flank, just above the hip. The marshal and his deputies came running, drawn by the gunfire. They found the shooter in the alley, one of Vance's hired guns, dead. They carried Silas to the doctor's office. Lena walked beside the stretcher, her hand gripping Silas's, her dress stained with his blood. The doctor worked by lamplight. Lena stood at the foot of the table, handing him instruments, wiping Silas's brow. Her hands shook, but she did not look away. She was terrified. This man was her anchor, her North Star. If he died, the victory meant nothing. The town watched from the windows. They saw the immoral woman tending the wounded rancher with a devotion that shamed their gossip. The widow Mercer arrived, pushing through the crowd with a basket of bandages. "He will not die," the widow told Lena firmly. "He is too stubborn to die." 2 days later, Silas was sitting up. The bullet had passed through the muscle, missing the bone and the gut. It hurt like hell, but he would live. But the work was not done. Vance had fled the hotel before the marshal could arrest him. Pike was missing. Silas strapped his gun belt on. He winced as the leather settled over his bandage. "You cannot ride," Lena said, standing in the doorway. "I have to," Silas said. "Vance is heading for the border. If he gets away, he will come back. He always comes back. I am coming with you," Lena said. "No?" Silas walked over to her. He took her face in his hands. "You have fought enough. Stay here. Be safe. I am done being safe." She repeated his own words back to him. Silas smiled, a weak, tired smile. He kissed her forehead. "Then stay here and make sure the judge signs those warrants. I will bring him back." Silas rode out with the marshal and a posse of 10 men. They tracked Vance's wagon to a narrow canyon 10 miles south of town. They found the wagon overturned. Vance's foreman, the man with the ring, had tried to navigate the ice and failed. The horses were lame. The foreman and 2 others were holed up in the rocks. Vance was with them. It was a short, violent siege. The posse pinned them down with rifle fire. Silas flanked them. He moved through the rocks, ignoring the screaming pain in his side. He found a vantage point above their position. He saw the foreman, the man who had grabbed Lena's mother, the man who had haunted Lena's nightmares. Silas raised his rifle. He had a clear shot. He could end it right there. Vengeance would be easy. It would be satisfying. It would be clean. He tightened his finger on the trigger. He thought of the fire. He thought of Lena in the jail cell. But then he thought of Lena's voice in the courtroom. "I am the one telling the truth. If he killed this man in cold blood, he was no better than Pike. He was just another man with a gun imposing his will. Silas lowered the rifle. "Surrender," he roared, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "You are surrounded." The foreman spun around, raising his pistol. Silas fired. He didn't shoot to kill. He shot the rock next to the man's head, spraying him with stone fragments. "Drop it, or the next one goes through your eye." The foreman dropped the gun. Vance, shivering in his expensive coat, threw his hands up. They brought them back in irons. The town turned out to watch the procession. There were no cheers, just a heavy, somber silence. The monster had been brought low, and he looked remarkably small in handcuffs. But one man was still missing. Harlan Pike. He had not run with Vance. He had tried to sneak out the back way, taking the train to Denver. Lena was waiting at the station. She had guessed he would not risk the road. She stood on the platform, wrapped in the widow's heavy coat, the wind whipping her hair. Pike saw her. He froze. He looked around for his deputies, but he had none left. He was alone. He tried to sneer, but it faltered. "Well, Elena," he said. "You came to say goodbye? I came to see you caught," Lena said. Pike laughed nervously. "I am just a traveler. Darling, no warrant for me yet." The marshal stepped out from the ticket office behind Lena. "Actually, Harlan," the marshal said, holding up a piece of paper. "The judge just signed it." Pike slumped. The arrogance drained out of him, leaving him looking like a sack of spoiled grain. He looked at Lena, trying one last time to hurt her. "You are still nothing," he spat. "You are still just a stray dog he took in." Lena stepped closer to him. She looked him in the eye. "I am a woman who owns her own life," she said. "And you are just a man who forgot that winter ends." She turned her back on him as the marshal snapped the cuffs on. She did not look back. The return to the valley was a quiet victory. Silas and Lena rode the buckboard wagon back to the ranch a week later. The snow was still deep, but the sun was out, bright and hard. They crested the ridge and looked down at their home. It was a scar on the white landscape. The blackened ruins of the barn stood like broken teeth. The house was gray and weathered. The herd was decimated. They had won the law, but they had lost nearly everything else. The money Vance had stolen would take months, maybe years, to recover through the courts. The cattle were gone. The feed was gone. Silas stopped the wagon. He looked at the ruin of his life's work. He felt a heavy weight settle in his chest. "It is a wreck," he said quietly. Lena reached over and took his hand. She squeezed it, hard. "It is standing," she said. "The roof is holding. The well is deep." She looked at him, her eyes clear and fierce. "And we are here." Silas looked at her. He saw the future in her face. It would be hard. It would be brutal work to rebuild, but he was not doing it alone. He lifted her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles, a gesture of profound gratitude. "Let's go home, Elena." They drove the wagon down the slope, the wheels crunching in the snow, moving toward the broken house that held the only thing that mattered. The fear had cracked, leaving room for something new to grow in the ashes. The return to the ranch was quiet. The wind had lost its serrated edge, softening into a breeze that smelled of pine needles and thawing mud rather than ice and death. Silas Reed pulled the team to a halt in the yard, the wagon brake groaning in protest. He sat for a moment, looking at the skeleton of his life. The barn was a blackened ruin, the charred beams jutting up like broken ribs against the sky. The corral fence was gap-toothed where the fire had eaten through the posts. The house stood gray and weathered, stripped of paint by the storms, looking small against the vast backdrop of the Tetons. But it was standing. Lena climbed down from the seat. Her legs were stiff from the ride. She walked toward the porch, her boots sinking into the slush. She stopped at the bottom of the steps. "Silas?" she called out softly. "Look!" Silas climbed down and joined her. Stacked neatly on the porch, protected by a heavy canvas tarp, was a cord of split firewood. Beside it sat a sack of flour, a tin of coffee, and a small crate of apples that had miraculously survived the frost. There was no note. There did not need to be. Silas walked over and touched the wood. It was red cedar, the kind that burned hot and clean. He knew the chop marks. It was the work of Thomas Miller, the neighbor whose fence line Silas had helped repair 3 years ago, before the valley turned cold. They remembered. Lena said. She felt a lump rise in her throat. Silas nodded, swallowing hard. He looked toward the south pasture. The herd was thin, pitifully so, but someone had thrown hay over the fence. The cattle were chewing contentedly, their breath steaming in the afternoon light. "We have work to do," Silas said, his voice thick with emotion he refused to let spill over. "But we are not starting from nothing. Rebuilding was not a triumph, it was a grind. The days were long and wet as the snow began to recede, revealing the black scars on the land. They worked from dawn until the light failed, pulling down the unsafe timbers of the barn, clearing the ash, salving the hooves of the horses that had survived the winter in the lean-to. But the hardest work was invisible. Lena found that safety was a garment that did not fit her right away. The trauma of the jail cell, the cold stairs, and the years of running had etched deep grooves into her mind. When the wind hit the house at a certain angle, whistling through the eaves, she would freeze, her hands gripping the edge of the wash basin until her knuckles turned white, transported back to the stone box in Silverton. She flinched when Silas dropped a hammer. She woke in the night, gasping, sure that Pike was standing at the foot of the bed with his iron keys. Silas saw it all. He did not try to hush her fears or tell her to be rational. He knew that fear was a ghost that had to be waited out. One evening, a plate slipped from Lena's soapy hands and shattered on the floor. She recoiled, backing into the counter, her breath coming in short. Terrified gasps, waiting for the anger, for the accusation of clumsiness. Silas, who was oiling a harness by the fire, did not look up in irritation. He set his work down. He walked over to her, his boots heavy and deliberate on the floorboards so she would hear him coming. He stopped 3 feet away, giving her space. "It is just a plate." "Elena," he said, his voice a low rumble. "We have more plates." "I am sorry," she whispered, trembling. "I am so sorry." Silas reached out slowly. He took her hands, which were wet and shaking. He did not pull her to him. He just held her anchor steady. "You do not have to apologize for gravity," he said. "And you do not have to be afraid of mistakes here. No one is keeping score anymore." He crouched down and began to pick up the shards. Lena watched him, the panic slowly receding, replaced by a warmth that had nothing to do with the stove. He showed up, again and again. He showed up. He met her terror with patience, teaching her nervous system that this place and this man was safe ground. Silas had his own ghosts to lay to rest. For 20 years, he had worn his guilt like a hair shirt, punishing himself for the orders he had followed and the fires he had set in the name of war. He had denied himself comfort, believing that a man with blood on his hands did not deserve to hold anything soft. 2 weeks after their return, Lena came into the kitchen to find Silas sitting at the table with a bottle of ink and a sheet of paper. He was staring at the blank page, his pen hovering. "Who are you writing to?" she asked, pouring coffee. Silas looked up. His eyes were clear. The shadows that usually haunted them retreated to the corners. "Sergeant Timothy Odell. He said he lives in Ohio now. We served in the same company. We were at the farmhouse together." Lena sat down opposite him. She did not speak. She waited. "I never wrote to him." Silas said, "I thought if I ignored him, I could ignore what we did, but I need to tell him." "Tell him what?" Silas looked at her. He looked at the way the morning light caught the dark waves of her hair. "I need to tell him that the war is over," Silas said quietly, "and that I have found a reason to put down the torch." He dipped the pen and began to scratch across the paper. It was not a confession. Exactly. It was a release. He wrote about the ranch. He wrote about the winter. And he wrote about Elena. He admitted in ink that would travel 2,000 miles that he was trying to be a man worthy of peace. Lena did not try to fix him. She read the letter when he offered it, and she simply squeezed his shoulder. She knew that she could not erase his past, just as he could not erase hers, but she refused to let him disappear into it. She kept him in the present, tethering him to the earth with requests for wood, with shared meals, with the simple, undeniable fact of her presence. The legal reckoning arrived with the mud of March. The circuit court judge returned to Silverton, this time with federal oversight. The proceedings were dry, bureaucratic, and entirely unexciting compared to the drama of the winter trial, but the results were earth-shaking. Silas and Lena stood in the back of the room as the gavel came down. The deeds Vance had seized were declared void. The land was returned to the families who had been driven off. The Millers, the Johnsons, the stubborn old man who lived up the creek. Vance's assets were frozen and liquidated to pay restitution. It was not a fortune. Lawyers and the government took their share. But it was enough to buy seed, to replace livestock, to buy lumber. It was not a perfect justice. Vance was in a federal prison, but his influence still lingered in the way some merchants looked at Silas. Pike was gone, rotting in a cell in Leavenworth, but the men who had drank with him still muttered in the saloons. Social prejudice did not vanish overnight. When Lena walked into town, there were still women who crossed the street to avoid her. There were still whispers about her foreign blood and the nights she had spent in the ranch house before the wedding bands were exchanged. But the venom was gone. It had been drawn out by the truth. One afternoon, Lena was selecting fabric at the Mercantile. Miller had begrudgingly reopened their credit line. Mrs. Gable, the churchwoman who had bruised Lena's hip months ago, was at the counter. Mrs. Gable looked at Lena. She looked at the quality of the wool Lena was buying. She looked at the way Lena held her head high, not with arrogance, but with the quiet dignity of someone who has walked through fire. Mrs. Gable did not smile, but she nodded. A short, sharp jerk of the chin. "Good afternoon, Miss Morales." "Mrs." Gable said stiffly. "Mrs. Gable," Lena replied. It was a truce. It was enough. Spring broke the back of the winter in April. The valley exploded into green. The creek, once a dry bed of stones, roared with snowmelt. Silas and Lena began to rebuild the barn. They could have hired men, some of the neighbors had offered, but they wanted to do it themselves. It was an act of reclaiming. Every nail they drove was a defiance of the men who had tried to burn them out. They were hoisting a beam into place, straining against the weight, sweating in the cool air. Silas slipped in the mud, his boots skidding, and sat down hard in a puddle of muck. Lena gasped, terrified he was hurt. "Silas?" Silas looked at his mud-caked trousers. He looked at his hands, covered in slime. He looked at Lena, whose face was a mask of concern. And then he started to laugh. It was a rusty sound, creaking and unused, like a door that hadn't been opened in years. But it grew. It rumbled in his chest, deep and genuine. Lena stared at him. She had never heard him laugh. The sound was infectious. A giggle escaped her lips, then another. Soon, they were both laughing, leaning against the half-finished frame of the barn, exhausted and dirty and alive. It was a turning point. The grim survival mode that had defined their relationship began to soften. They shared slow mornings on the porch, watching the sun hit the peaks, drinking coffee without the desperate need to ration every bean. They touched more easily. A hand on a shoulder, a brush of fingers when passing a tool. One evening, as the peepers sang in the creek, they sat by the fire. "I was thinking," Lena said, her voice tentative. "The widow Mercer. She says her eyes are failing her. She cannot read her Bible anymore. And the feed store needs someone to balance the weekly receipts." Silas looked up from his book. "You want to work for them?" "I want to be useful," Lena said. "I want to build something that is mine. I am good with numbers. Silas, I can teach the children who cannot get to the schoolhouse. I can help the businesses that cannot afford a clerk." Silas studied her. He saw the ambition in her, the need to be more than just a survivor. He did not feel threatened. He felt proud. "You would be the best bookkeeper in the territory." He said, "Do it." So she did. She rode into town 3 days a week. She balanced ledgers. She read letters for those who could not read. She taught a small group of children on the widow's porch. She built respect not by apologizing for her past, but by proving her value in the present. She forced the town to see her not as a curiosity, but as a necessity. The question of the future hung between them, unspoken but heavy. Lena was still sleeping in the room at the top of the stairs, though the door was rarely locked anymore. They were partners in every sense. Yet there was a hesitation, a fear of naming the thing between them. It was a warm night in May when Silas asked. They were sitting on the porch swing he had repaired. The air smelled of sage and damp earth. "Elena," Silas said. She turned to him. The moonlight softened the angles of his face. "The contract," Silas said, looking at his hands. "The one we made. It was for the winter." Lena went still. "Yes, it was. The winter is over," Silas said. He turned to look at her. His gaze was intense, stripping away her defenses. "I do not want you to go," he said. "I want you to stay. Not as a hand, not as a housekeeper." He took a breath. "I want you to stay as my wife." Lena felt her heart hammer against her ribs. It was what she wanted. It was what she had dreamed of in the quiet dark. But the old fear reared up, the fear that love was just a precursor to loss. "Silas," she whispered, "I am afraid." "Of what?" "Of belonging," she admitted. Her voice broke. "When you belong to someone, it gives the world a place to hurt you. If I stay, if I truly stay, then I have everything to lose." Silas reached out and took her hand. He held it tightly. "You are right," he said. "It does. It makes us vulnerable. It makes us targets for grief." He leaned closer. "But Elena, look at what we survived. We survived the fire. We survived the ice. We survived the law. If we live our lives guarding against the hurt, we're just waiting to die. I'm done waiting." He looked at her with a fierce, quiet certainty. "I would rather risk the pain of losing you than the emptiness of never claiming you." Lena looked at him. She saw the truth in his eyes. She saw the man who had pulled her from the river, the man who had stood up to the town, the man who had learned to laugh again. She realized she had a choice. She could live as a ghost, safe and untouched, or she could live as a woman, open and brave. "I am done being a ghost," she whispered. She squeezed his hand. "Yes, Silas, I will stay." They did not have a grand wedding. The valley had seen enough spectacle. They went to the small church on a Tuesday morning. The widow Mercer stood as their witness. The preacher, a new man who had replaced the one who turned his back, read the words from the book. Silas held Lena's hand. His palm was calloused, warm, and steady. When the time came, he produced a ring. It was not a diamond. It was a band of gold, simple and heavy, purchased with the money from the first sale of the spring calves. "With this ring," Silas said, his voice rough with emotion, "I thee wed." He slid it onto her finger. It felt heavy. It felt like an anchor. Later that day, they walked into the mercantile. The store was busy. Conversation lulled as they entered. Silas walked to the counter, Lena's hand tucked into the crook of his arm. He looked at Miller. He looked at the men by the stove. He did not shout. He did not make a speech. He simply turned to Miller and spoke with a quiet, granite certainty. "My wife, Elena Reed, will be handling the accounts from now on," Silas said. "Please update your ledger." He looked around the room, meeting every pair of eyes, daring anyone to challenge the title. No one did. Miller nodded respectfully. "Of course, Mr. Reed, Mrs. Reed, Mrs. Reed." The name hung in the air, solid and real. Lena felt a flush of pride. She squeezed Silas's arm. They bought their supplies and walked out into the sunlight. Not as a scandal, but as a family, there was one last echo of danger. It came in June. A rider, a straggler from Vance's dissolved outfit who had been hiding in the hills, rode down to the ranch. He was drunk, desperate, and looking for a fight. He stopped at the gate, shouting insults, waving a pistol. He called for Silas to come out. Silas stepped onto the porch. He had his rifle, but he did not raise it. He watched the man with a calm detachment. "Go home, son," Silas called out. "The war is over." The man raised his gun. "You ruined us," he screamed. "You took everything." Before Silas could move, there was the sound of hooves. from the East Road. Thomas Miller rode up, a shotgun across his saddle. From the west, the young ranch hand Silas had protected came riding in. Even the widow Mercer's buggy appeared on the rise. The valley had heard the shouting, and this time, they did not close their shutters. They came. The rider looked around. He saw the neighbors forming a line. He saw the rifles. He saw that Silas Reed was not standing alone. The valley remembered. But now, it remembered that it had a conscience. The rider lowered his gun. He looked at the wall of community standing against him. He spat on the ground, turned his horse, and rode away into the dust. He never came back. The story ends on a morning in late spring. The mud had dried into solid earth. The grass in the pasture was knee-high, a vibrant, impossible green pushing up through the soil that had been black with ash only months before. The cattle were grazing, their coats sleek. The barn was finished, smelling of fresh pine and hope. Silas and Lena sat on the porch steps. Silas was whittling a piece of cedar. Lena was mending a shirt, the gold band on her finger catching the light. The wind blew down from the mountains. It was still wild. It still carried the scent of snow from the high peaks. It would always be a hard country. The drought would come again. The winter would return. But as the wind swept over the porch, ruffling Lena's hair, she did not flinch. She leaned into it. She reached out and rested her hand on Silas's knee. He covered it with his own. They were two survivors who had found each other in the wreckage. They had not erased their darkness. They carried it with them, a map of where they had been. But they had chosen to build a fire in the center of that darkness and call it home. They watched the hawks circle in the blue sky. They listened to the creek sing, and they sat together, belonging to the land and belonging, finally, to one another. Thank you so much for listening to the story of Silas and Lena. It has been a journey through the ice and fire of the American West, and I hope their fight for survival and belonging resonated with you. I would love to know where you are listening from. Please leave a comment below and share your location. If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to From Wild West for more stories of grit, history, and the human spirit on the frontier. I also invite you to share your thoughts on the story in English. Did Lena's choice to stay surprise you? What did you think of the community's transformation? Your comments help keep these stories alive. Thank you for your time, and safe travels until we meet again on the trail.